Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Xu Qinduo. Despite the differences in civilization and values, the G20 brings together the world's major economies to seek common ground for development. So, through promoting civilizational exchanges and mutual learning, what can we expect from this year's G20 summit to solve global rifts? What should be done to avoid a clash of civilizations? And what needs to be done to enhance the voice and representation of the Global South in the international arena? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined by Huang Jing, University Professor from Shanghai International Studies University, Professor Mohan Kumar, Director of the Jindal Global Centre for G20 Studies, and also former Indian Ambassador to France and Bahrain. John Ross, Senior Fellow from the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China, and Salman Al-Ansari, Saudi geopolitical researcher. Welcome to Dialogue. We'll start with the controversy surrounding the name of the host country, India or Bharat. Professor Mohan Kumar, we'll start with you. What's in the name here?
Yeah, I want to thank CGTN for having me. It's my first time, and I'm happy to be part of this illustrious panel. You put together a very fine set of people, as far as I can see. So my first reaction to your question is a rose smells as sweet with any other name. So I don't think the name should matter, really. It's a bit of a non-controversy. The Indian Constitution actually has both India and Bharat. And as my Saudi colleague and friend said, Bharat is a name that people use in everyday conversation. And I think from my perspective, as long as I am allowed to use whatever name I like, Indians like freedom, Indians like choice. So as long as I am allowed to use whatever name I prefer, I think that's fine. So it should really not be anything more than a controversy. Frankly, it shouldn't be a controversy at all. And at this point of time, I don't think a decision has been taken.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor, there is one quote actually by BJP, the ruling party politician, unnamed, told an Indian broadcaster, said that the word India is an abuse given to us by the British, whereas the word Bharat is a symbol of our culture. What's your response?
So you'll have people disagreeing with that. India is a rough and tumble democracy. People are entitled to their views, and that's the view of that particular gentleman. I wouldn't necessarily see it that way. A lot of Indians wouldn't see it necessarily that way. And that is why I think as long as Indians have a choice to call their country whatever they want, it should be fine.
Mm-hmm. Well, John Ross, it's said that, Prime Minister Modi indeed think that, there's a need of efforts to quote, liberate ourselves from the slavery mindset. Is the talk of name or change of name part of that effort?
Well, as I think the British rule of India is one of the biggest crimes in the whole of human history, I think the best thing that Britain can do is keep out of the matter. So I'm not going to say anything about it at all. It's entirely up to the people of India to decide.
Yeah, anyway, when we talk about the name, it's about like a mixture of different elements, colonialism, legacy, culture, history. So of course, here G20 brings together a broad representation of not only the 20 largest economies, but also countries with different history, different civilization, culture, and languages, political systems here. And here's one point, actually. It's really about how we treat differences. Should we somehow appreciate and embrace the differences or condemn the differences? Huang Jing.
I think that the differences is a way of life. This world is so beautiful because we're all different. So I think the matter is how much, number one, how much we can tolerate each other and respect each other on their own rights. Number two, do we want to, practice so-called double standard on this? Last but not the least, I think that the tolerance does not mean that we agree to disagree, but means we know we are different. That's why I try my best to understand, try to put myself in your shoes, to understand where you come from. Then we can have a better understanding and confidence building. So differences is a way of life. Again, we should all appreciate it.
So, Mr. Al-Ansari, at the same time, acknowledging the differences, in the background, obviously, for the largest economies, there's a need for them to work together for unity. For better dealing with the global challenges and economically and politically. And how can they do that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and hi to all the respectful guests with you. I think one of the best answers to that is to go back to the slogan that India has written with regards to their G20. They said it and they called it One Earth, One Family, One Future. And that is actually important to emphasize. We should not forget that the G20 members represent more than 80% of the world's total economic output, 75% of global trade, and 60% of the Earth population. So I think the responsibility on these countries are humongous, and I think we really need to work together to take the world to a better place rather than just being in constant conflict with each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of the cultural exchanges and differences and the attitudes to treat the differences, Huang Jing. If you look at China and India, India, the hosting country of G20, if you look at the long history of exchanges between the two countries, you see there's a lot in common. There's a lot of learning from each other. There's a similarity in terms of the Chinese side, putting forward the initiative, a global civilization initiative. Basically, it stresses very much about equality, respect, and learning from each other. And even the theme, as our guest mentioned, one Earth, one family, one future, which is kind of similar to the Chinese idea of, a common community with a shared responsibility, shared system for the mankind. And of course, both countries also are calling for, say, multilateralism, genuine multilateralism or reformed multilateralism. So what kind of multilateralism for, say, China and India, for the global south? Or is it different from, say, the multilateralism in the eyes of Western countries?
I think that multilateralism depends how you look at it. I think from India's point of view, if I understand right, or from China's point of view, I think multilateralism first and foremost means we are all equal. We should respect each other on equal footing. Secondly, we should all tolerate this kind of differences between us. Exactly because we're equal, that's why we cannot say that which one is better, which one is worse. Last but not the least, if there's any differences I want to point out between the so-called global South multilateralism and the so-called Western multilateralism, I think there is a conscious or subconscious kind of arrogance or kind of me-centered kind of feature in the for example, G7 groups. They believe they're the ones who should be the kind of leaders or even masters of the world. The world should center among them. Even though this is, just as I say, might be subconscious, but it is very clear, a very good demonstration of this, that I'm better than you, this kind of mentality that they try to, apply double standard when they talk about multilateralism, when they're dealing with others, especially, for example, when they talk about universal values. Values are good. We all have our values, but we're similar to each other on some good part of those values. But the problem is that, the double standard or hypocrisy was kind of applied when they try to use this kind of multilateral approach or the values to judge on each other. In other words, multilateralism means we do not make judgment on others just because I think it is right. And also means that since we're all equal, then we should try to understand each other. That is, we are fundamentally not different. In other words, there are differences in degrees. I agree, but they should not be. And there is not difference in kind in our human beings, because we all live in the same village. We're all the same species.
Mm-hmm. John, how do you see, people would say, the global civilization initiative by the Chinese side is a response to the theory of clash of civilization, which stresses the differences of different civilization, and ultimately that kind of difference will lead to a clash.
Well, I don't think it's a response to it. I think it's developed from more fundamental things, but nevertheless, it clearly counterposes itself to such a conception. I mean, the fundamental point that made by Xi Jinping is that as it is the differences between countries, actually, strange enough, or it's very clear to an economist, which are very beneficial. I mean, if you take my own country, one of the most delightful things I've seen in my life is in 1950, go back to the 1950s, it was a very grey country. We ate the same food on the same day of the week. We had no cultures. Now it's become a much more interesting place to be because we've got huge numbers of cultures which are there. And sometimes you have a little bit of a culture shock. I know in the 1950s, people said, well, we don't know about this curry. And now curry is more popular than fish and chips in Britain. You know, that's the way things go. And I think that's the same for other countries. The decisive thing is that what countries get voluntarily from other people. If you take my country, right, every country in the world teaches the mathematics of Newton. Every country in the world teaches the theory of evolution of Darwin. Every country in the world likes Shakespeare. They like that. We learn things from India. We learn things from China. We things from other countries. What they don't want is they don't want visits from gunships, which is the types of things that my country used to engage in. They don't want unilateral economic sanctions. They want to have the freedom to decide what they want to learn from other countries, and they'll find out, as President Xi Jinping said, if they do that, their own society will be greatly enriched by the things which it learns from other countries. So, of course, this is counterposed to the clash of civilizations, but it wasn't developed to oppose such a stupid theory. But it was put forward for more fundamental reasons. But of course, it opposes this theory.
Professor Mohan Kumar, you were nodding your heads while John Ross is speaking. So you do agree with, the idea like, different civilization. There are differences, but we should respect the differences and learn from each other and then enhance ourselves.
No, I was nodding vigorously to what John was saying. If I can call you John, please call me Mohan. I absolutely agree with him. India is an interesting place because I come from the South, and people in the South are so different from people in Delhi. We eat rice, they eat wheat. We are vegetarians by and large. They eat meat, and I think it's diversity that really makes the nation of India strong. And I suspect what John says is absolutely true. When I teach children or students in my school or in the university, I basically tell them, can you accept a view that is not yours? Can you look at views that are not yours, consider them from all aspects, and then come to a reasoned judgment about what your views are? And that's what we say is critical thinking. And that's the only thing you can teach kids these days, because everything else is bound to be either on the net or bound to be irrelevant. So I think that the only other thing I want to say, I also agree with my colleague from Saudi Arabia, by the way, he's absolutely right as well. But what I do want to say, though, on multilateralism is you're right that China and India have a similar perspective. Having said that, China already has a seat in the high table. You're already a permanent member of the Security Council. We are not. So for us, reformed multilateralism means something different from your multilateralism. What we want to say, or what we mean when we say reformed multilateralism, is that countries which don't have a seat on the high table must have a voice. So that is the difference, I would say. But otherwise, I completely agree with my co-panelists. If you don't embrace differences, it's very hard to manage them. Mm-hmm. And then get into all sorts of controversies and arguments about me versus you, me versus you. You get into identity issues within countries, between countries. So that's not such a good thing. So while we can say these things are good, I don't want to be a pessimist, and no diplomat should be a pessimist in any case. But the fact of the matter is the world is on the cusp of fragmentation, frankly. I don't see too much of unity of purpose and so on. So I don't believe you should apportion blame So I wouldn't blame the West in its entirety, frankly. I think you have to look at the different actors, how they perform, how they act, and then see how in each circumstance we can try and figure out a solution. If you get into the trap of the West is bad, the East is better, then you get into the same problem of how it becomes more difficult to solve issues. So I would avoid labeling people, but I would very much say that I agree with my two other colleagues and also our Chinese colleague who spoke earlier about embracing differences. He's right. I think the key is, can countries come together at a time like this? Because whether it is public health, whether it is cybersecurity, whether it is climate change, it is impossible for a country to do anything about it, regardless of whether it is United States, China, India. It's not possible for any single country to do anything meaningful. So how do we come together, setting aside the differences? Some people want to say something on Ukraine, others don't want to say something on Ukraine. Some people want the debt of lower income countries to be forgiven, some others don't. If you take sustainable development goals, the latest Global Sustainable Development Report of the United Nations makes terrible reading. Half the world has been left behind. The world is off course. So what can the G20 do in these circumstances? That really is the existential question facing all of us today. How to set aside differences, come together, and work for the larger good.
Well, John, among the many problems we are going to solve or we are expected to solve, one is mentioned earlier is the debt issue for developing countries, in particular low-income countries, partly because the reliance on US dollar, and then when the US increase the interest, and then that creates more trouble for developing countries, like paying the debt, that's more burdensome for some countries there. Is there anything we can do in that respect?
Well, the most fundamental thing is that needs to be a great deal of debt forgiveness. That's what's necessary to get the global economy going again. We have I'd link this question about the dollar and the question of debt together. We have got a bad situation in the world at the present time, whereby the US is dependent upon import of capital from other countries. It's astonishing figures for the first half of this year, which is the United States actually, the depreciation of US capital is greater than the creation of capital in the US. You've got a strange paradox. The world's #1 capitalist country is not creating any capital. This has only occurred twice before in US history. One was at the height of the Great Depression, and the other was during the international financial crisis. I mean, I was so astonished when I saw this figure for the first quarter. I wrote an article and said, look, we've got to be very cautious about this because let's see if it continues or it's just a freaky number. Well, but when the second quarter GDP results come out in the US, it's continuing. What this means is the world's largest economy is dependent upon capital that it's taking, we can say by their financial system, from other countries. It's like the US has become the world's largest economic parasite. And I know it's very shocking to people, but that is actually the situation. And this is intolerable, a situation whereby it is still almost the highest per capita GDP in the world, apart from a few tiny little countries, that the world's largest economy with the highest per capita GDP is being run by taking capital from other countries. This is an impossible situation to continue. And that's what's behind the indebtedness. What should be happening, the traditional thing should be, of course, that the high income economies are able to export capital and undertake investment in the less developing countries. But at the present time, the less developed countries are subsidizing the United States. This is an extraordinary situation. And that's what creates the debt. And if we're going to get this system going again, we're going to have debt forgiveness for these less developed countries as part of a reorganization, hopefully a consensual one. I look forward to seeing what President Biden says. Sometimes I'm afraid there's been more talk than action, but I hope he will say something good. What we need is a peaceful reorganization of this international system.
Professor Mohan Kumar here, speak of the debt issue, speak of the debt issue in particular associated with this less developed countries. It's important to have their voice heard. In that respect, we see the strong endorsement of the G20 membership of African Union from the US, from China, from India. India is working hard to include the African Union. In that respect, how important is it to have African Union as an independent member of G20 here?
I think it's terribly important to have the African Union, no question about it, because a number of those countries are actually seriously indebted. I just want to say that the G20 has done a lot of good work on reforming the multilateral development banks. And an Indian ex-finance secretary, N.K. Singh, have produced a roadmap for capital adequacy frameworks for these multilateral development banks. That's an excellent document. I just happened to read it last night. The second part of the report will be produced in October. They talk of massive recapitalization of the IMF and the World Bank. So I think it is extremely important what John says about debt forgiveness. May I also add that China is an important creditor. Let's not, get away from that. You have loaned a lot of money to low-income countries, and I think China's participation, China's cooperation will be very, very important in getting a consensus paragraph on the debt forgiveness issue. I think the G20 has done a good job by talking about debt service suspension initiative. They're talking about a common debt framework. And if they can also succeed in endorsing some of the roadmap recommendations for reforming the multilateral development banks, and if China can chip in with whatever it can, then I think for me, that would have been the most important, because you will recall that India had a Voice of the Global South Summit in January 2023 with a virtual participation of 125 countries. I must tell you that the three most important things they talked about was debt and debt relief, second, food security, and third, climate change. Those were very, very important priorities outlined by the countries of the Global South. So one litmus test for me to determine whether the G20 is successful would be how it handles the debt issue. And as John says, I also look forward to the final outcome document on 10th of September.
Al-Ansari, last year, just like this year, I think people expected deliverables, something to be delivered from the G20 summit. But last year, because of the differences over the Ukraine crisis, a joint statement was prevented. What about this year? For European countries, for example, and Western countries in general, their a preferable topic or their priority is really about the Ukraine crisis. But for the countries from the global south, let's say, their concern is really about the development and the climate change, food crisis, for example. In what way can they, say, cooperate or can compromise and find a common voice in terms of the deliverables of the summit here?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. And it is actually unfortunate that a lot of analysts put an extensive focus on the hard power and military confrontations and major conflict dynamics when they speak about the G20 meetings. And as the famous phrase goes, if it bleeds, it leads. But in reality, the G20 as a whole, and since its inception in 1999, is mostly an economic group. Definitely the Ukraine conflict with Russia, etc., has overshadowed the G20 the last 2 or 3 G20 meetings. But I'm personally optimistic about the near end of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Both nations have to seriously allow the countries that offered their mediation services to do their part. And I know that Kiev is definitely tied to the U.S. position. But inside the U.S. itself, we are seeing a rising momentum to end the war and look for peace rather than incremental escalation. So that's why I'm kind of optimistic with that regard. And I'm actually happy that we have been discussing mostly economic themes, because that's what should be discussed with regards to the G20. And I'm actually proud of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia when they hosted the 2020 G20, and they contributed mostly to the things that you guys have mentioned with regards to the poor countries. They solidified the global positions with regards to these nations in need via debts forgiving that equals $40 billion. And also the IMF, a couple of days ago, they stated that Saudi Arabia had the fastest growing economy among the G20 nations and the lowest unemployment rate in history. And one of the things that the IMF mentioned was debunking the latest reports about criticism of Aramco CO2 emissions, and it praised Aramco for taking green considerations. So seriously, we see a lot of areas of cooperation that we can deal with our G20 friends, because this will show that we are serious in focusing a lot on our domestic affairs, focusing a lot on bettering the lives of the people we have, focusing a lot on respecting each other, and not to be in a position where we impose our moral codes to upon others, because that's not going to work, and it's not going to be the major thing that will work in the near future, specifically because we are seeing multilateralism to be taking real stance on the ground. It's not only hypothetical, it's something that we see. And I actually have one point that I want to refer to with regards to the point about the IMF. Is it too late for the IMF and the World Bank, etc.? I don't think so. I think they have a lot of areas where they can actually evolve and develop their work. And one of the good things about multilateralism is the fact that when we see BRICS and we see all these Shanghai cooperation, these are considered to be somehow, in the eyes of some people, that are competitors to the World Bank and the global financial system that is led by the United States and the West. But I see it as a way through which you escalate the competition that is healthy for each party to do their best. So that's why the IMF is trying to catch up, not because they wanted to do so, maybe because they actually wanted to better their reputation and position, because there is a competitor in town. So I think healthy competition is beautiful, healthy competition is good, and we should not look at it as an adversarial kind of position between the East and West.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.